and bust. Tobacco, slaves, and representative government. Pocahontas, a daughter of Powhatan, who had been kidnapped by the Jamestown colonists, married one of them, John Rolfe, in 1614. The wedding brought a ceasefire to the hostilities between the English and the Powhatan. Around that time, Powhatan's brother, Mr. O, took over as ruler of the tribe. Under his guidance, Indians studied the ways of the English. They traded with the English, served in their militias, stockpiled their guns, and secretly prepared to attack them. The colonists were unaware of Mr. O's scheme, but they were unleashing a devastating counterattack the Indians without even realizing it. That counterattack was the Columbian Exchange. One of its most powerful weapons was tobacco. Tobacco had been unknown in Europe until Spaniards brought the plant back from the Caribbean. Exotic and addictive, it had swiftly become a craze among the aristocrats of Europe. By 1616, according to one estimate, London alone had more than 7,000 tobacco houses, cafe-like places where the city's growing throng of nicotine junkies could buy and smoke tobacco. The profoundly destructive effects of tobacco on human health, especially on the lungs, would not be proven until centuries later. However, some authorities did try to ban it early on because they believed it to be unhealthful or immoral or disturbing to the social order. Unfortunately for the English, at first the only source of fine tobacco was the American colonies of hated Spain. London tobacco houses were thrilled by the sudden appearance of tobacco leaves from the Jamestown colony. Tobacco was shipped across the Atlantic in huge barrels that held half a ton or more. Those barrels were carried back to Virginia full of ballast, that is, packed with dirt to give them weight and keep the ships stable. Dumped on Virginian shores, that ballast very possibly contained the earthworms that made themselves at home in North America. The native tobacco of Virginia was the species Nicotiana rustica. It was much less desirable to the English and Europeans than the species found in South America and the Caribbean, which is Nicotiana tabacum. John Rolfe talked a shipmaster into bringing him some N. tabacum seeds, and soon that variety of tobacco was growing in the Virginia colony. After Rolfe's marriage to Pocahontas created the ceasefire with the Indians, the colonists were able to expand tobacco production explosively. By 1620, Jamestown was shipping 50,000 pounds of tobacco a year. 3 years later, that figure had almost tripled. Within 40 years, the Chesapeake Bay, the Tobacco Coast, as it later became known, was exporting 25 million pounds of tobacco a year. Individual farmers were making profits of up to 1,000% on their investments. Newcomers poured in, grabbed some land, and planted M. tabacum. English-style farms spread like rumors up and down the James and York rivers, so many colonists flooded the Virginia that the company realized it could not control them completely from across the ocean. In 1619, it created an elected council to resolve disputes. This was the first representative governing body in colonial North America. Barely 3 weeks later, a Dutch pirate ship landed in Jamestown. It carried some 20 African slaves, and it was called the White Lion. Another 30 showed up in a second ship a few days later. The colonists had been clamoring for more workers to increase their tobacco crop and profits. Without a second thought, they bought the Africans in exchange for food the pirates needed. The purchase was a landmark on the road to slavery. Within weeks, Jamestown had begun two of the longest-lasting institutions of the future United States. One was representative government and democracy, in which people have a say in their government. The other was chattel slavery, in which human beings are bought and sold as property. The tobacco boom came late for the Virginia Company. It had exhausted its resources and run up debts, sending ship after ship across the ocean in the first years of the colony. The company was running out of money on March 22nd, 1622, when Mr. O attacked Jamestown. The assault was brutal, widespread, and well-planned. At least 325 people were killed that day, and the aftermath claimed at least 700 more. The attack disrupted spring planting, so the colonists planted less corn than usual. Trying to rebuild, the company sent over more than 1,000 new colonists, but no food supplies. The luckless souls were dumped ashore, where they were forced to eat tree bark and scrabble over handfuls of corn. It was the starving time all over again. About 2 out of 3 Europeans in Virginia died that year. The Virginia Company did not survive this disaster, yet English settlement in Virginia did. Although Mr. O's assault was a setback, the English had begun reshaping the landscape into something unrecognizable to Indians. Indians had traditionally raised small amounts of tobacco in their gardens. The English, in contrast, covered big areas with tobacco farms. Planting tobacco on a massive scale has a massive environmental impact. Tobacco absorbs the nutrients, nitrogen, and potassium, removing them from the soil. As they harvested the exported tobacco, the English were sending those nutrients away on ships. Soils in Chesapeake Bay were thin and easily exhausted. By planting huge areas with tobacco, the English quickly wore out their fields. As a result, they felt the constant push to clear new land. The colonists quickly grabbed most of the land that had been cleared by the Indians, then moved into the forest, cutting great numbers of trees. Removing trees and using plows exposed the soil and made it vulnerable. Rain washed away nutrients when dry land without tree cover eroded more quickly. With fewer trees to capture and hold rain, floods were suddenly more common. It became harder and harder for the Indians to find suitable areas to farm, so they moved farther into the interior, giving up the coast to the foreigners. Tobacco from South America was far from the only biological import to Virginia. Pigs, goats, cattle, and horses multiplied. The colonists lost control of their animals, which devoured Indian gardens. The worst may have been the pigs. Smart, strong, and always hungry, rampaging pigs ate the fruits, nuts, corn, and edible bulbs that made up the Indian diet. The people of Sanakamoko found themselves competing for their food supply with packs of feral pigs. In the long run, though, the biggest impact may have come from a much smaller imported creature, the European honeybee. The English imported bees for honey. They did not know that bees also pollinated crops. The bees pollinated anyway. Without their invisible work, many of the plants that Europeans brought to North America, including peaches, apples, and watermelons, wouldn't have multiplied. Removing trees, introducing bees and earthworms, exhausting the soil, shutting down the annual burning, unleashing pigs and other grazing and rooting animals. In these ways, the colonists changed Sanakamoko so much that it became harder and harder for the Indians to prosper there, but easier and easier for the Europeans. By 1650, the former Tsanakamoko Empire was mainly inhabited by Europeans.